Okay, hey YouTube. I just wanted to give my opinions out there on if you read the title, then you know what I'm talking about. Resident Evil 2 and the possibility of a remake. Now, Yoshiaki Hirabayashi, one of the producers of Resident Evil 6, had an interview with GameSpot. I'll put the link in the description to that interview if I can find one, or any news article talking about it, so you guys can more or less read what was said for yourselves. But basically, what he says was, you know, if there's enough fan support, Resident Evil 2 could be remade. He didn't just say HD remake, and he made it clear that there were, of course, there were no plans for Resident Evil to be remade right now. But what he also said was, if enough fans clamor for it, basically if we demand for it, we could get it. I don't think it would be that great of a remake, but I'm only saying that because, with all the recent games, if you don't take your say in it, give some feedback, then of course we're not going to get that great of a remake. I mean, unless, the Resident Evil team has, let me just say it this way, unless they have the guts to go and, replay the original Resident Evil from the PS1, and then replay their remake of that game on the Nintendo GameCube. We won't get that kind of treatment. I mean, it would be nice to get the game, to get a remake of the game the way it's meant to be played, like in its classic survival horror state. Updated visuals, the classic gameplay, before Resident Evil 4 came out. If we get that classic gameplay but with updated visuals, that would be great. I would be all for the remake. I mean, they could add more stuff, just like in the remake, it was basically the same story. Since it was a remake, of course, it has to stay the same in terms of story. And there was some was completely rebuilt. So while a lot of the same areas were there, they were somehow changed. And then there was extra areas added. They could do that if they really wanted to. They could do this right. And since it would be a remake of a game from, the earlier days, I think it would make sense to more or less keep the classic gameplay style in there. None of the over the shoulder, definitely no changed enemies, because we will be dealing with the T-virus once again, so there would really be no reason to change anything in terms of enemies and whatnot. Not unless you're going with the Resident Evil remake version of the enemies, being the zombies, and the fact that they became Crimson Heads within 2 hours if you didn't burn them or shoot off their heads. But if they were to remake it and try to make it like the most recent games, it would suck. Because, you're talking about Resident Evil 2. This is one of the first few and one of the best games out there. So, if they were to remake it, they would have to keep it intact. They would have to keep the gameplay. They would have to keep the atmosphere. Like, they would have to keep it all. The gameplay, the places, the characters, of course. Could they update the character models? Yes. They can even use Resident Evil Darkside Chronicles, since they have all the environments there updated or anyway, as a kind of template and just kind of build up from that with the visuals. I mean, like, yes, I'm not saying use those exact visuals, but use those as a kind of guideline if they were to do the remake. But in terms of the gameplay, go back into those old Resident Evils, go back to Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, and use those for their gameplay reference material. And the Resident Evil remake. So yes, they could definitely do that. Will they, if they were to do this? I don't know, because right now they said if there's enough fan support, they will consider it. Like, they could consider it. And could it happen? Yes, it can. But even if it does, it doesn't mean we will get it unless they actually stick to their word and do it. And instead of trying to cater to the little kids, the fact that games like that get targeted to ages 17 and up, being the mature audience, they should stick to that. And they shouldn't change the design just because someone said it's too scary or, something like that. I mean, because that's what happened with, Dead Space 3, if I remember right. And that game's not even out yet, but I remember hearing one of the developers talking about it because I was at GameStop, and you know how sometimes they play those little GameStop interviews on their TVs whenever you go to a GameStop store. And I literally heard the developer say, due to the feedback that we got saying it's too scary, we basically sacrificed the fear in favor of the action. So if, Capcom was to do that with this, since they're kind of throwing fans a bone here, that a Resident Evil 2 remake is possible, that would just, throw them in hot water. I mean, they're already in hot water to begin with the way they handle things now, their business. So, unless they can manage to actually pull this off, I wouldn't want a remake. I mean, if they're going to remake it, then they better do it right. And I'm not... Before everyone says, you can't have that feeling of entitlement, believe me, I know about that, but we're talking about a classic Resident Evil game. So it should be, classic Resident Evil. It should have that same treatment that the Resident Evil remake, which was released on the Nintendo GameCube back in 2002, and still holds up pretty well to this day. It should have that same treatment. The fixed camera angles, the same gameplay, just updated visuals, maybe updated cutscenes and some updated choices. Maybe some added elements, but that's about it. Because they can add to it. They can put new areas. They can add more puzzles, change them up a bit if they wanted to. Things so that you can explore, because the Resident Evil 1 remake, it had everything that Resident Evil had. It had everything that the original game had, plus some more. They didn't really change the feeling and tone of it just to satisfy all these teenage kids that like to play Call of Duty. They had remade that game and left the story, left the atmosphere intact, the enemies intact. They left pretty much everything intact and just, added some extra stuff to it. And not to mention that the voice acting in the remake was better than the one in the original, even though the games are classic, but I do think that the remake had the better voice acting, definitely. And that brings me to another thing. if they were to remake this, who would be voicing the characters? I know that Alison Court would be voicing Claire because she says as long as, Capcom calls her, she'll keep voicing Claire. She'll keep on doing it. And her voice hasn't really changed within this last decade, so can she do it? Yes. She can still be Claire. So I don't think we'll have any problem as far as Claire goes. But who would be voicing Sherry? Who would be voicing Ada? Because Sally Cahill doesn't seem to be voicing Ada recently. Leon's voice actor is always changing, and Sherry, um, Laura Bailey did a decent job as her in the Dark Side Chronicles. So would she be willing to do Sherry for the Resident Evil 2 remake if they were to do it? I would hope so, because she's a decent voice for Sherry. Um, but who would be voicing, William Burke, and who would be voicing Annette? Who would be voicing Hunk? Because you gotta think back. I mean, we're talking about Resident Evil 2 here, so you gotta think of what characters were in the game, and maybe who would sound great. For maybe 2 characters right now, we at least have an idea, but the other characters, you gotta wonder who would voice who. I mean, especially since they're always changing voices for a lot of these characters. Sherry, it's understandable because, they gotta have a voice that sounds like a little girl, she's 12 years old, so they gotta have someone who could pull that off. But the other characters, you gotta wonder. Other things I'm concerned about for Resident Evil 2, if they were to remake it, is, who would be leading the project? What changes would they make if they were to remake it? Aside from the obvious change being, the voices and the graphical changes, what would they try adding to it? I could see it being maybe noob shooter friendly right about now, only because, that's what they're most used to, and they don't seem to be trying to reignite that horror flame. Aside from Resident Evil 6, which looks like it's making a nod to horror, but it's not entirely horror, because there's still action in it. But for Resident Evil 2, they should think classic. And I'm not saying this as an entitlement thing. I'm saying this as we're talking about a classic game. If it's getting remake treatment, it should be a remake, not a completely new game, Meaning, leave the gameplay intact. Leave the atmosphere intact. Leave all that stuff. And don't try to sacrifice horror for the sake of sales. Because selling out like that hurts the chances even more of making sales for what should be a remake of a classic game. So, if anything should change, it should just be the graphics, of course the voice acting, because they can't get everyone that worked on the voices back then, so they have to get whoever they can for today's voice acting. The only person I see coming back will be Alison Court to voice Claire, but that's about it. And maybe Laura Bailey as Sherry, since she voiced Sherry not too long ago anyway. But that is about it, because she's and Laura Bailey, she's all up in Street Fighter and Resident Evil lately, so I could see her voicing Sherry again. And then of course, maybe extra areas and extra puzzles to the game. But those are the few things that I could see being needed. They don't really have to change much. And of course the cutscenes, they're going to have to reenact them a bit differently. But other than that, there really shouldn't be much changes in terms of changes to it. Anyway, I just wanted to get my thoughts out there of how it should be done. I'm going to leave my video here, and please leave your thoughts. Bye.